inventory, cash. There's fixed assets like machinery and equipment and real estate. And then there's a whole bunch of intangible assets like intellectual property, like customer relationships, assembled workforce, goodwill. All of those assets deserve a return. So the idea of the excess earnings method is to isolate the cash flows that are due to the IP only, and then again discounting those to present value. The royalty savings method, or relief from royalty, the concept there is because you own the IP, you don't have to pay someone else a royalty for its use. So the value is equal to the present value of those future royalty savings due to ownership of the IP. So the steps involved in the royalty savings method, first step is to determine, well, what's an arm's length royalty rate? If I were to have to pay a royalty for the use of this technology or trade name, what royalty rate would I be paying? Once you've determined that, then the next step, again, is to discount those future royalty payments that you're saving to present value, again, at the appropriate discount rate. You will often see advanced techniques out there as well, other variations like Monte Carlo simulations and real option models. Those are just different ways of really modeling cash flows for the subject IP. For Monte Carlo simulations, again, you'll look at different probability distributions for the different variables, and then for real option modeling, again, you're looking at probability trees, decision tree analysis, binomial lattices. Again, just fancy ways of modeling out the future cash flows that can be attributed to the IP. As far as the market approach for IP valuation, again, here you're focused on market transactions and you're looking at actual transactions involving comparable intellectual property. There are a lot of databases out there that provide information on transactions. The problems with the market approach for IP valuation is, one, that information is sometimes hard to get. You're usually limited to what's available publicly, so you won't always know the facts and circumstances behind each transaction. So for that reason, you have the information, but it's always questionable how much you can rely on it. The other problem with the market approach for IP valuation is comparability is an issue. IP is unique by definition, so to find comparable IP out there that's directly comparable to the subject IP that you're trying to value can oftentimes be a challenge. Cost approach, like I said before, is based on the principle of replacement or substitution. And what that means for IP is it's the costs to develop or replace the IP, or oftentimes, if it's a technology, the cost to design around the IP, if it's a patent. The problems with the cost approach for IP is, first of all, these costs are often difficult to estimate. And then the other really major issue with the cost approach for IP valuation is that cost does not always equal value, and oftentimes it doesn't. Just because it may cost a lot to develop design around technology, if there's no economic benefit to that technology, well then, again, the value it's not worth anything. So cost doesn't always equal value. And then the last issue with the cost approach is it doesn't consider the income potential of the IP. And again, that all brings us back to cash flow. Cost, again, doesn't consider future cash flows that can be generated by the IP. So for that reason, the cost approach typically isn't used in IP valuation. You will see it sometimes in valuations of software. So assets that don't produce income per se, you will often see a software valued with a cost approach, but that's really it in terms of IP. So as far as factors that impact IP value, if you haven't heard it enough already, it's all about cash flow. So what that means is you're going to be focused on the revenues and the costs and profits of a business that's associated with the IP. And then, like I mentioned earlier, the challenge is isolating the cash flows that are due to the IP only as opposed to the other assets of the business. Other factors that impact IP value, remaining useful life. Again, and all these other factors have an impact on cash flow. But remaining useful life, what we're talking about is the economic life versus statutory life. You may have a patent that might have 10 years left in its statutory life, but if it stopped producing economic benefit 2 years ago, well then the economic life is really zero. And that's what really matters in terms of valuation. The stage of development is also important, especially for technologies that are maybe still in development. When you're doing evaluation, in that case, you have to consider the risk of actual commercialization of that technology. Will it really work? And the other thing you need to consider is the costs to get you to that stage. If there's additional development costs that are required, well, then you need to factor that into any kind of valuation. Other factors that impact IP value, the market and industry that you're in. Obviously, if you're in a growing versus a maturing market, that makes a difference. The competitive environment, what other competing products are out there, how is that going to affect your cash flow stream going forward? That's also important. And then obviously uncertainty and risk. And again, we try to capture a lot of that in an income approach in our discount rate that we're using. But certainly there's always uncertainty and risk out there in everything you look at. Reaching a value conclusion. Valuation is definitely an art as opposed to an exact science. I could have the same set of facts that you've given another valuation appraiser, and we could come up with different answers, hopefully not too different. But again, it's really, like I said, there's not an exact formula, unfortunately. A lot of assumptions need to be made, but as long as those assumptions are well supported, then you can feel good about your valuation. It's always good to use more than one approach if possible. Again, I mentioned the income approach as the preferred methodology. There's different variations of an income approach that you can look at. I would also recommend always looking at the market approach, even though there are problems with it in terms of comparability and information. The market approach, there's always market data out there, and you need to be aware of it in any valuation that you do. Common sense and intuition, obviously. Adjust your results based on past experience and industry practice. And then the last step that we always do is we'll reconcile the IP value with the value of the overall business. So we'll do maybe a quick and dirty business valuation that for the business that's associated with the IP. And we just want to, as a reasonableness check, we just want to make sure that the IP value makes sense when you look at the value of the overall business. That's IP valuation in a nutshell right there.
Great. Thanks, Rob. We appreciate it. Obviously, these issues get a little complicated. I don't know about everybody this morning, but I know my head is pounding over these issues. So I apologize. Yes, sir. I apologize that we had to start with the math portion. First thing right out of the box. But Mark has a question.
It's more of just a comment on this panel. This is like my favorite panel. Just for everybody, just so they know, I believe the IP issue is probably the biggest cyber risk issue facing the United States. The theft of intellectual property, trade secrets by foreign governments, by actors all over the world. This panel represents, I think, the brightest up there in helping our customers understand what are the issues, how do we value IP, big struggle for clients, and then how do we protect IP. It's my favorite panel, and I just wanted everybody to kind of put it in context. This is sort of focused on privacy, but in my mind, this is one of the bigger issues out there. And it may not be coverage for this, but this is on the minds of really the Fortune 2000. So, thanks.
And that's a great point, and it's certainly an area that I know clients don't pay enough attention to. We get a lot of calls after they've lost their intellectual property or their trade secrets, they've been misappropriated. And when you sit down with clients and you talk about what they're doing to protect themselves, I always ask them how much money they spend on developing their products and their IP, and conversely, how much do they spend on protecting it? And I'm stunned at how little companies spend at protecting these assets. And really, it's the heart of their organization typically. And they don't spend the time and money doing it. If you're not asking the right questions, they're not paying attention. So it really is important to ask the questions and help them realize what they need to be protecting. With that, we'll go and we'll talk a little bit about some of the claims. Lincoln?
Thanks. I don't know what a Hollywood entertainment litigator's doing here in Philadelphia at a cyber risk policy, but I'm going to do the best I can to be relevant here. What I want to talk about is the fact that with the advent of the internet, everybody has now decided to become a publisher because it's very easy to do. It's very easy to get on a Facebook site. It's very easy to get out there and get messages out that normally other people that had expertise in doing that would do it, and now everybody's doing it. But the issue here is you become a publisher. And when you become a publisher, you take on a lot of different liability, a lot of new forms of liability to be aware of. And you also take on some obligations to protect your IP from other people who might do things with it without your permission. So it's a big picture to try to cover, and I'll try to cover it quickly. Use of social media or getting out there into the world can give rise to a number of different liability theories, and they're listed here. For example, defamation, people getting online and saying various things about people. If you make a false and defamatory statement about somebody, and depends on who that person is, what your state of mind is as to that statement might be relevant, but it can lead to lawsuits. So if you say negative things about a company or say negative things about a company's product, you could have a trade libel claim or things of this nature. So you can have employees who are getting on your site and making comments maybe perhaps on behalf of the company and subjecting you to liability. So defamation is a primary concern when you're doing these things. It's important to have policies, to ask, do you have policies about what people can or can't say? Although when you start getting into the world of making policies about what your employees can or can't say, you're going to get into some employment issues that can get very sticky because there's certain National Labor Board rights to, for example, comment on the conditions of your work. So you can't have a broad policy that says you can't say anything at all negative about the company because that might actually violate some rights that employees have. So it's a complicated area that can subject you to liability in a bunch of different directions. You have to be careful. Another form of liability is there's these 4 basic invasion of privacy torts, which I litigate quite a bit in. And there's some interesting things that are going on in this area. The first tort is intrusion, not something that comes up too much in terms of general big companies, what have you. But intrusion is when you invade into some private or personal area without permission. Classic intrusion claim is recording someone without their knowledge. Depending on the state you're in, for example, my state, California, it's an all-party consent rule. If everyone to a conversation is not aware it's being recorded, you've got yourself a very serious problem. Those are how those typically come up, or going into someone's house or hospital room or places where they have a reasonable expectation of privacy can give you concerns there. That's not really a social media issue because that's really a gathering of news type of issue. So I don't focus on it too much. What one is interesting is the private facts tort. And that's a tort that says if you reveal private information about somebody, truthful private information, you can get sued and face serious liability. The issue really does often come down to, is it a matter of legitimate public concern or not? But if you've got people on social websites talking about, so-and-so sleeping with this other person or whatever, you're going to have a problem. You're going to have an issue with revealing private facts about somebody. What's interesting in this area that's going on right now, there's a couple things that I think are things to be aware of in the future. We're always worried about what's the next big thing. So here's my 2 next big things, okay, for you to think about for the future. One is there's this movement in Europe called the right to be forgotten. And it really relates to old information about you that exists and is floating around there on the internet. What right do you have to get that removed, get that sort of erased from people's memories? We don't really have that here. In fact, in the U.S., we have some law that's sort of the opposite of what they're doing in Europe, which is, once something's out there, it's a matter of public interest, and that doesn't fade with time. It just kind of stays a matter of public interest, and there's not much you can do about it. And as long as it doesn't violate any of these other things, if it's truthful but a matter of legitimate public concern, then there's no liability. If it's not defamatory, etc. But in Europe, just in May, the European Union issued an opinion that basically said that, and this pertained to Google and to any other internet search engines, they said, look, if somebody says your search results is coming up with this bit of information about me that is no longer really relevant or no longer of any interest to anybody, you have to take down that link. You have to remove it so that when someone does a search, they won't come up with it anymore. Now, it's not telling Google you've got to somehow go to wherever that information is and obliterate it. It's just saying you can't it can't come up as part of the search results anymore if somebody legitimately can show that it's, quote, inadequate, irrelevant, or no longer relevant. I'm not sure the difference between irrelevant and no longer relevant. So this related to a guy who had a bankruptcy or some bankruptcy information from years ago, and he said nobody cares anymore. It's not of really great interest, and the European Union said that's got to come down. So I don't know if that's going to make its way here. There's grumblings that might make its way here. And what is the liability for internet service providers who don't take down that link connection? It's going to be a very interesting area to see how much of this right to be forgotten, this ability to sort of scrub your past, makes its way over to here. So I think that's something to watch. The other thing that's interesting in the right of privacy is this sort of perfect storm of claim that I think is going to happen one of these days. And it's the combination of something called behavioral advertising and data breach. You thought for a second you wouldn't hear about data breach, sorry. And here's how this will work. Behavioral advertising are these companies that track every single website that you go to. They track everywhere you go. And they do it for a reason. They do it to see what you're interested in so that they can push advertisements to you. That's the main purpose of it, is to, so if and you may have noticed this when you're out on the internet. Maybe you needed some shoes or something. You did a little search of Nike or something. And then all of a sudden you're reading Time and there's shoe ads on the side all the time. You're like, oh, wow, they're psychic. No, that's behavioral marketing. They knew you were looking at shoe ads, and so they started pushing advertisements to you. Well, there's a giant, massive database out there of every single website you've gone to. They've essentially followed you all day long. It's kind of like if you were at the mall. They've followed you and watched what every store you went into. They checked out what you're interested in. Who knows what websites you've been looking at and you're interested in. But there's a database of that. Combine that with a data breach where somebody gets a hold of that information and wants to use it for not a wonderful purpose of pushing you shoe ads, but for a purpose of extorting you, for a purpose of embarrassing you, and saying, here's some other things besides shoe ads they were checking out last night at 3 a.m. So when those two things come together, the behavioral marketing database and a data breach, I think we're going to see some massive things. So is there protection against extortion and these kind of things for people who've become aware of that? So I think that's something to look for in the future. And I also think there's also a lot going on with behavioral advertising. Is it something that people are fond of, and do you have to opt in or opt out of it? So that's something that's a big area right now. Final thing, I won't talk about false light. It's really kind of defamation junior, so it's boring. Misappropriation under the right of privacy is a very interesting one to keep in mind for social media, because it involves using someone else's likeness, name, image, or any sort of identifying information about them. It may not even be recognizably them, but something about them that's uniquely associated with them, without permission can give rise to liability. This is happening all the time. People are just constantly using other people's names, likeness, images without permission, thinking it's fine to do it, and getting hit with massive, massive claims. Recently, there was a sort of a drugstore type company that tweeted out, "Oh, here's Katherine Heigl leaving our store. She must have got some stuff at our store." That's a no-no. That is a blatant use of someone else's identity to draw attention to your product or goods or services without permission, and is going to result in, she's already sued for some $10 million or something. I had a trial 4 or 5 years ago for Buca di Beppo restaurants where they had used some models' images without permission in an ad campaign, and we went to trial with the plaintiff seeking $28 million. It would have busted the company. These are huge, huge claims, and they're happening all the time because people think, oh, I've got a picture of this celebrity or that, I'll just throw it up on the website, and it's a problem. I have a client that is a hair cutting service, and they have a Facebook page, and they'll put up they'd put up a post that said, you know, here's all these actresses at the Oscars last night. Who do you think had the best hair? And I'll go, no, get out of here. Take that down. You're going to get a claim out of that because you're using that person to draw more attention to your goods, and that's all it takes for one of those claims. So that's something to be really on top of your social media people. Make sure they understand you can't do that kind of stuff without permission, or you're going to have massive claims. I won't talk about the privacy statutes. interference with business relations, let's skip that, or breach of contract. Let's go on to the more IP-related stuff. If I can get this to work, let's see. Copyright infringement. To have a copyright is very simple. You just need originality and fixation. And as soon as you have that, you have a copyright. So you snap a photograph instantly. You've got a copyright in that photograph. If you sat down right now and wrote a little 5-line poem or something, boom, you fixed it, tangible medium of expression, you have a copyright in it. You don't have to register it to get a copyright. You don't have to go through any formalities. You simply have to have originality and fixation. So a lot of things are copyrighted. In the social media context, there still exists, although it's gotten better over the years, this notion that everything on the internet is free. It ain't. It's somebody else's copyrighted work. A video is someone else's copyrighted work, a photo, etc. And it's just so easy to right-click and yank something off and put it up on your site or do something, and that is a copyright infringement. And the problem with copyright infringement is the statutory damages remedy in terms of the real risk here, and that is that under copyright law, you can ask for a certain amount per work infringed rather than have to show actual damages. You could just say simply, give me amount per work infringed. If it's deemed to be a willful infringement, you knew that it was an infringement and you did it anyway, it can go up to $150,000 per work. Well, you've got these websites that are yanking tons and tons of photographs. You've got hundreds of photographs that weren't licensed, that they've got on their websites. I've got 3 or 4 of these cases right now. That's a lot of money when you start doing that math. So you have to be very careful to avoid using other people's works without permission. Trademark infringement. Trademark infringement is relatively simple. How do you get a trademark? You get a trademark very simply. You use a name or a mark or a design in connection with goods or services in commerce. That's it. You have a trademark in that. You don't, again, no formalities required. There is registration process you can do. It gives you some benefits, but you don't have to. So as soon as you start putting up the McDonald's M, that's it. You got a trademark. And so you can use that mark to obviously to distinguish your goods and services, but you can also prevent others from using marks that are similar in a manner that might cause confusion of consumers. So if you put up something on a social media site in such a manner that it seems to imply endorsement or affiliation or some connection, then you're going to have problems because that's going to draw a trademark infringement claim. If you put up a trademark, if you use a trademark in a association with something sort of gross and nefarious and offensive, you might have a trademark dilution claim where you're diluting the value of the mark by associating it with something that is otherwise unpleasant. So, and then finally you might have something that's called blurring through, it's trademark dilution through blurring, and that is you just use a mark that's similar to another mark, and it's or the same as another mark. There's no confusion because you use it in a manner that everybody knows it's not the other company, but you've now blurred that word. So the example from years ago would be to say, and this tells you how old this example is because it uses Polaroid, but if you started selling Polaroid refrigerators, no one's going to go, oh, hey, I think the camera company sells refrigerators now. We get it. They don't. But when we heard the word Polaroid, we thought cameras. That was it. We don't want people to think refrigerators now. It lessens and blurs the value of the trademark. So you have to be careful about the marks you select, and that can also result in very, very large claims. Idea submission is something to be very careful about. This is something I litigate very frequently, and that is giving an idea to somebody else. Normally an idea isn't protectable by copyright law, may not even be protectable under patent or anything else, but it doesn't mean it's not protectable at all under the law. If you disclose an idea to somebody under a circumstance where there's a contractual relationship, then using that idea in breach of that contract can give rise to a claim. So this is the classic sort of Hollywood pitch thing where someone pitches something with the understanding if you use it, you're going to pay me, you're going to make me a producer, blah, blah, blah. That kind of stuff can be problems. Now, how this comes up in social media is when companies say, hey, tell us your great ideas because we're trying to do some new thing. Well, you may be creating some kind of contractual relation that's going to result in a claim. Does get interesting in the insurance contract, in the insurance context, because is that a breach of contract claim, so it's not covered? It's a little different animal. Most E&O carriers recognize that's a different kind of contract animal than your standard sort of breach of contract claim, so it's probably covered. But it's something to make sure you look at. Is that kind of thing going to be covered if a claim comes up? Because it's really more, it has more of an IP theft flavor, even though it's deemed a kind of contractual thing. Data breach, you've heard 1,000 times, Skip. Most of these other stuff, I'm going to stop now because I'm run out of time. But the general thing to keep in mind is operating a social media site or getting out there in the world, you're a publisher, you're a speaker, there's all kinds of obligations that come with that, and you got to make sure you've got people who understand that, who are vetting things and reviewing things, and you've got insurance that covers it.
Thank you very much, Lincoln. We appreciate it. As Mark mentioned, these threats to IP and trade secrets are growing rapidly. Marshall's going to discuss some of the growing threats.
All right. There we go. So my name is Marshall Heilman. I'm a managing director with Mandiant. My job, basically, as it is just to investigate computer crime and figure out who's stealing intellectual property. Jim had made a comment that I wanted to kind of counter-comment on. You had said that most companies they don't spend, or I believe what you were saying is that they don't spend the necessary amount of money required to protect their intellectual property, especially if it's important. I've got a couple funny examples I wanted to cover before I actually go into my talk. Sure. Is that better? Much better. I also have a bad habit of speaking quickly, so please throw something at me or let me know if I am speaking too fast to be understood.
What'd you say? Was throwing something at him?
Nothing.
You said throw things at him. Oh, throw things at you. Okay.
So it's actually it's more common than you would think for me to walk into a company that's been breached and say, okay, you've been breached. Obviously, you've been tipped off that something has occurred in your environment. What would an attacker be going after? And I hear it all the time. There's nothing. There's nothing an attacker would want to steal from my environment. Okay, well, first of all, why am I here, right? Because if you don't have anything to steal, then who cares? And so what will happen is we'll do the investigation and we'll start to uncover what it was the attacker took. And it's not always that the attacker took this glob of data here. Sometimes it's a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit here. When you put together the entire story, you can say that, well, the attacker took this type of data and this amount of data. Then I go back to the client and say, well, we discover what the attacker stole. He stole this data here. And the reaction I get is usually very different. It's usually along the lines of, oh my God, that's everything we have. Well, I thought you didn't have anything worth stealing. Apparently, you lied to me. You do. So a lot of times companies don't even realize the value of what it is they have, or they believe that their information is so scattered nobody could possibly understand it all, which is obviously a misnomer. The other thing that a lot of companies don't understand, some of the attack groups that we deal with are extremely sophisticated. They're not necessarily going after you as a company and the intellectual property that you have because that's their end game. Oftentimes they may want to build this thing over here, and this thing is made up of lots of different parts. And each one of those parts is manufactured by a different organization, or the plans to build that part are stored by a different organization. So what we find is the attacker may compromise 10, 20, even 100 different companies to get to their end state, which is to build this particular thing. So yes, the company may not have intellectual property that's really all that important in and of itself. When you combine that with everything else these attack groups are stealing, you now have something that's extremely important and extremely valuable to the attacker. Okay, so it's just something I wanted to point out. As you can see from some of the headlines I have on the slide behind me, cybersecurity threats are a growing problem. Everybody's becoming compromised. In my industry, we have a joke. It's not if you're going to be compromised, it's when you're going to be compromised. And I usually also joke with companies I'm talking to and say, if you don't believe that you're going to be compromised, it's simply because you're not making anything worthwhile. Right? If you make something worthwhile, someone's probably going to want to steal it. So who are these villains that are breaking into organizations? Right? It still amazes me, too, that every now and then people still have this opinion, if you will, that it's a nerdy little pimply kid sitting in their basement hacking. Or that, like you see on TV, it's some guy who sits down and says, I'm hacking into the FBI. He types a couple of keystrokes. He's into the FBI. He's doing his thing. It's not really the way it works. Okay? Most organized attack groups, and I would argue that any attack group really worth anything, they're going to be made up of professionals. They're people just like me doing the exact opposite of what I do. So these are people that have studied computer science. They understand how computer security works. If they're breaking into your industry, they probably understand your industry at least as well as you do. So in other words, you're going up against an evil version of yourself, okay, whose job it is to steal the stuff that you're paid to protect. So in other words, you're not going up against amateurs, you're going up against professionals. So what does that really mean for you? Well, the first thing it means is that you have to protect from a million different vulnerabilities, all the different avenues an attacker could use to break into your particular environment, right? The attacker only has to exploit one thing, or maybe possibly two things. So the attacker has the advantage. He knows what he knows what he's trying to do in your environment. You're guessing. He has to find one mistake that you or your company make. You have to try and patch them all. So you're immediately at a disadvantage. All right, as you can see from the slide here, There were only 33% of companies that Mandiant worked with last year were able to detect the fact that they had a breach. 67% of the companies that we worked with were told by some external organization. Maybe it was Mandiant, maybe it was another intelligence organization, maybe it was a government organization. The problem here is that only 1/3 of companies are actually able to even detect the fact that they've got a problem. Right? Then if you look at the graphic on the right, you can see that the average number of days that the companies we worked with were compromised, 229, or 7.5 months. So even if you are detecting it internally, you're still waiting 7.5 months to figure out, to understand that you even have a problem. How many people here truly believe an attacker is not able to accomplish whatever it is they wanted in your environment in 7.5 months? Good, nobody. So I did offensive work long before I came to Mandiant and started investigating computer crime. And I can tell you that a couple days, a week, even a month was the maximum amount of time it would ever take to accomplish whatever it is you want to do in someone's environment. So within 7.5 months, the attacker has done anything he wanted in your environment. The other scary statistic, look at the bottom number. 2,287 days was the longest amount of time that an organization had been compromised that we worked with. That's over 6 years. By that point in time, not only is the attacker taking everything that you're doing, he's actually probably replicating your business model and using you to attack lots of other companies. The other thing I wanted to point out, the New York Times came out with a statistic I think it was 2 years ago actually, when they were compromised. And they said that of the 45 pieces of malware that were found in their environment, their antivirus vendor only caught one. We're not talking about, in this particular case, the stealthiest of malware or some of the coolest and slickest stuff that we've come across. We're talking about your average generic piece of malware created by a target attacker. Right? And we're finding 1 out of 45. That's terrible. So the point I'm trying to get across here is that it's not if a breach happens to your organization, it's when, as long as you make something interesting, right? And an attacker has the advantage. They're able to break into environments faster than we're able to detect them. And therefore, it will continue to be a growing problem. So let's talk about some of the different types of attackers that we deal with. Nuisance threats. These are the things, nuisance threats are things that make headlines a lot for individual users. Something like Citadel or Zeus or Zero Access, or other types of malware that are infecting your personal computer. Now, I hear it all the time. Why would an attacker target me? I don't have anything of interest. In general, you're right. An attacker's not going to target you. You're not that interesting. They don't really want anything from you. Okay? However, an attacker that can compromise 20,000 of you, right? Now, all of a sudden, they've got a big pool of people to pick from. More than likely, 1 out of those 20,000 people are going to be interesting. More than likely, some number of those 20,000 people are only using a username and password to interact with their banking application. So an attacker can log in as them and start stealing money themselves. Again, maybe you don't have that much money in your bank account, but 20,000 of you, when combined, now the attacker just made a couple $1 million. Right? So in general, you're right. Attackers are not targeting you personally. They're targeting the collective you, which will net them a lot of money. Hacktivists. I used to say before last year, the hacktivists really aren't a big deal. Now, when I say hacktivists, I'm talking about the Syrian Electronic Army, which has gotten a lot of publicity recently. I'm talking about groups like Anonymous and Lulzsec. Groups that basically make a lot of noise, and they talk about how, I hacked the FBI or I hacked the CIA. It's like, well, actually, you defamed a web page that mentioned the word CIA. You didn't hack into the CIA, right? So the people that make a lot of noise and really accomplish absolutely nothing, okay? But I've changed my opinion on whether hacktivists should be something that you worry about or not. If you look at the slide I've got behind me, the Syrian Electronic Army was actually able to hack the Associated Press Twitter account. And actually not that hard of a feat, username and password. It's not like they did something really complex. But the point is they're able to access this account, send out a tweet that the White House had been bombed, and you can see that the Dow tanked for a period of, I think, 5 seconds or so when everyone thought that, yes, there had been another attack on America. Didn't really happen, and everything recovered, but it shows the damage that could be possible from people saying things that aren't actually true. All right, so now I'd argue people pay a little bit more attention to hacktivists than we ever did before. So data theft threats. You've heard a lot about intellectual property here and why it's important to protect it and so forth. China is probably the country that has the worst rap in terms of intellectual property theft. Everyone is talking about the fact that China is stealing this and stealing that and blah, blah, blah. What a lot of people tend to overlook is they're not the only country doing it, and they're also the organizations that we tend to track coming out of that country are not the only organizations going after intellectual property. We see a lot of stuff coming out of Eastern Europe. We see stuff coming out of Europe itself. So it really just depends. In general, any type of organized cyber criminal group, which is an extremely lucrative market, is going to go after intellectual property. Intellectual property is what companies have that can net an attacker a lot of money. Yes, an attacker could come in and maybe wire themselves $1 million from a company, right? Or the attacker could come in, steal your intellectual property, which may be let's say a cure for cancer, or something really cool like that, sell that in the black market. That's going to net them much more cash. As you said before, it's all about cash, right? So financial crime. These are going to be attackers that solely and exclusively focus on stealing money from individuals or organizations. These attackers tend to be actually very good at what they do. They use very sophisticated malware. They use very cool techniques to accomplish their mission, but they're actually pretty lazy. And the reason I say this is that they're lazy is because they don't have to be that good and they don't have to pay that much attention to what they're doing. So to give you an example, a couple years ago we came across an application that attackers were using, and they're using to gain access to banks and credit unions and so forth. And what the application would do is, the attacker would first say, show me all banks in the world. The application would go out and come back and say, there's this many banks in the world. Then the attacker would say, of all the banks in the world, show me which ones are credit unions. And the application would come back and say, well, you now have this many credit unions. Then the attacker would say, show me all credit unions in the world that are running an IIS web server with a Microsoft SQL backend. And the application would come back and say, well, there's this many credit unions running IIS server with MySQL backend. And the attacker would say, great. Now show me, of all those results, which ones are vulnerable to SQL injection. SQL injection is a way for an attacker to interact with a backend database. The application would come back and say, well, there's this many. Then the attacker would say, great, here's my drop-down box, here's all the organizations, I'm going to select this organization, go and do this. Literally clicks a button, the application goes out, compromises that organization, pops a command prompt back to the attacker, he now has access to this particular organization. He really didn't lift a finger. He coded one application that he was able to use to compromise hundreds of different credit unions in this particular case. It's really smart, really slick, but really lazy at the same time. Imagine if he actually tried really hard to target an organization. So my point there being is that these financial attackers are really good. We just, a lot of times, they don't have to be as good as we know that they can be. So what do they actually do once they break into an organization, right, and they steal some data? Well, in some cases, they sell the information to the highest bidder. So what we're starting to see now is attackers will actually break into what we're calling a target of opportunity. So an attacker may break into, let's say, Bank of America. And rather than taking the risk of doing something in Bank of America themselves, the attacker will advertise in the underground, hey, for $5,000 or $10,000, I will sell you access to Bank of America. Who wants in? There's always a buyer. I'm dealing with a client right now where that's the case. An attacker was actually selling access to a previously compromised system. This is a company that had gone public, where the attacker said, hey, if you want back into this particular company and you want access to this information, pay me $5,000. All right? Then there's credit and debit card fraud. This is where the attacker is able to clone your credit or your debit card and make purchases on your behalf. Sometimes we see attackers do it to buy themselves new TVs and things like that. Usually those aren't the real good or the sophisticated attackers. Most attackers that really know what they're doing, they're going to steal your credit card or debit card information. They're then going to use that to purchase 10,000 TVs on your behalf. They're then going to sell those 10,000 TVs in the black market, then turn around and sell the credit card information also in the black market before they get caught. So now they've basically gotten paid twice for one theft. They're selling the gear in the black market, and then they're selling the credit and debit card information in the black market. Then there's something called ATM PIN fraud or unlimited operations. This is where an attacker is actually able to clone your debit card, and they're able to get access to your PIN. It's not the easiest thing to do in the world, but it does happen. When that happens, what attackers will do is they'll take your card, they'll clone your card usually a couple thousand times, and they'll have a bunch of mules around the world go to various ATMs and withdraw some amount of money from your bank account. So the very first thing I thought of when I heard this is, well, I've only got $2,000 in my bank account, let's say, right? Go to town, have fun. It's not worth the hack in order to get $2,000 from my account. The problem, though, is money in account, at the end of the day, is really just a number in a database. Numbers in databases can be changed. An attacker that's able to get access to your debit card information and your PIN information more than likely has the ability to interact with that database and twiddle some numbers. So now what we're seeing is my $2,000 account will be changed to a $500,000 account, which gets completely withdrawn. The attacker will then log back in, give me another $500,000, which gets withdrawn again, and it happens over and over and over again. And that's called an unlimited operation. One question I usually get asked too is, let's say an attacker is able to withdraw $1 million from ATMs. How much do the attackers actually keep, and how much goes to the rest of the distribution network? On average, the attackers behind the entire attack will keep about 33% of whatever is netted. All right, chargeback fraud. This is pretty neat. So what chargeback fraud does is an attacker will get access to some type of business, and like say an insurance company or medical company or something like that, and they will basically they will authorize a refund of a certain amount of money to cards that they're controlling. So they may log in and say, this particular person's insurance covered 100% of whatever this was. Send this amount of refund to this card over here. And what they do is they do that at a large scale, and they're basically sending money that didn't really exist to themselves. All right, it's called chargeback fraud. And finally, probably the most well-known of financial fraud, it's called ACH or wire transfer fraud. ACH fraud is when an attacker is able to log into a company and send payments on the company's behalf. So what we see most frequently is, let's say I'm an art dealer, and I frequently send payments to one of my suppliers. The attacker will go in, he'll leave the supplier information the same, he'll just change the supplier's bank account to his bank account. So me as the art dealer, I think I'm making a payment to my supplier. The supplier contacts me a month later and say, why haven't you paid? I say, well, I have paid. Here's my proof. And the problem is my proof shows a different bank account because I paid the attacker, I didn't actually pay my supplier. And then wire transfer fraud is where the attacker will, as I was talking about before, log into, let's say, one of my personal bank account or someone's personal bank account and simply wire money to an account that they control. So it's very lowbrow fraud. It's really not that hard to pull off. And then finally, cyber war threats. This is something that we really don't see that much of, at least in the unclassified world. If you look at what Russia's been doing recently, back in 2008 when they took over Georgia, it was very interesting because they took out Georgia's entire internet presence prior to their attack. And now if you look at what they're doing with Ukraine, we start to see denial of service attacks against social media, against the country's internet connectivity, against mobile phone networks, and so forth. So cyber war threats are going to become a reality as really cyber war starts to take off and more people become comfortable with it. So it's just, I thought, kind of an interesting note to include here. I do expect to see this at some point in time, but I have not, at least in the unclassified world, seen this being used to a large scale yet. All right, with that, do I have any questions? Hopefully I woke you up.
Yeah, Marshall, thank you for scaring the hell out of us. We appreciate it. Garrett, what
I was going to say, I have thieves who steal lots of money and then keep 33% of them. They're called plaintiff's lawyers.
That was yesterday's panel. So, Garrett, what, if anything, can we do from an insurability perspective relative to these threats and issues?
Can you hear me? Yes. There we go. Closer. There. Yeah, so I'm going to speak about the insurability of intellectual property. So I know yesterday, I believe there was a Cyber 101 panel, and so this will be kind of a quick intellectual property insurance 101 discussion. So often as brokers, we get phone calls and people say, we need to get intellectual property insurance, and their first question back is, what type? Because there's a huge difference in the insurability of these risks based on what type of intellectual property we're discussing. So things that are fairly easy to insure are like copyright, trademark, trade name, trade dress. That type of stuff is pretty easy to get done. In the mid-90s, as an example, we were looking to cover software copyright because the copyright process, as mentioned before, is quick and easy. Its patents are too slow moving for software. Software changes too quickly. So they started using copyrights to protect software. And so we started using media policies to cover software companies and pick up copyright protection that way. Since that time, 20 years later now, there are cyber policies, there's blended forms. We're adding these intellectual property areas to tech E&O policies. And then historically, there's always been in GL policies, just in the context of advertising. So like if you put up a billboard and you wind up infringing on somebody, there's some coverage for that on the GL policy, but it doesn't cover traditional lawsuits for these areas. These are easy. Where it starts getting tricky is more of what we're getting worried about, with this panel, which are areas that have some value to them. So patents are difficult to insure. The reason why they're difficult to insure is because we can't underwrite them very well. I had a patent program about 20 years ago where I had the pen on it, and the underwriting model was we would price it more expensively if there were more patents. And what we learned is that's a terrible way to do it. Now the approach is the opposite. Lawyers will tell you that you want to do kind of a porcupine thing. You want to patent every single thing you can. What you need to underwrite for patents isn't the number of patents that the company has, that kind of thing. You need to underwrite the space that they're in. You might just have one patent, but if your patent is potentially infringing on Apple or somebody like that, you might be a very bad risk from an underwriting perspective. So the difficulty for insurance underwriters is there aren't very many efficient ways to underwrite that and to understand that space in an efficient way so that we can put quotes out and say, okay, here's what might happen, and so we can underwrite it. Trade secrets are difficult because, trade secrets are everywhere. If you don't know what those are, they can be anything from a customer list to the way you do something at work. Anything that you try to generally protect from the public is a trade secret. You don't register it. Where you see them come up most commonly is an employee leaves and they take a customer list. They take content that had been created, that sort of thing. It's very difficult to value. There is definitely value to it. Sticking with the customer list example, if the employee leaves, they take the customer list and they pass it out, there's some value in that you have lost, but it's very difficult to say how much that is and should you be remunerated for it by an insurance company because it left. For both of these as well, these are areas where hackers would try to go after things that are trade secrets, that are patents, these types of intellectual properties, copyrighted stuff perhaps, but trade secrets are definitely a big area for concern with hackers. So what can we insure with these? On the patent side, there are a couple different approaches. First, NPEs are patent trolls. If you're not familiar with that, patent trolls are companies that acquire patents with the sole purpose of suing other companies for licensing revenue. And patent trolls, if you're not familiar, I pulled a few stats. Last year, in 2013, there were 5,000 defendants for patent troll lawsuits. There were 3,500 lawsuits from patent trolls. And there were, compared to normal patent lawsuits, non-NPE lawsuits, there were only 1,800 of those. So the majority of the patent marketplace, if you will, is, from a liability standpoint, are NPE claims. There is one company that's focusing solely on that space. It's called RPX. They're not an insurance company. They are an aggregator of patents, kind of a white hat patent troll, if you will. They have a subscription service where companies like Google pay them money. They acquire dangerous patents out of the marketplace, and then they use them for their customer base to try to protect the people that are their subscribers. They've also launched an insurance product that's a kind of a sidecar to their membership. And if anyone has an interest in that, they can let me know. We're the ones distributing it at this time. From a general patent standpoint, there are only three markets really, and that's not Libert, that's Liberty, a little typo there. But IPISC, Samian, and Liberty. Samian actually is supported by Liberty, so that's kind of 1.5 markets, if you will. They're sort of the same. There you can get general patent coverage for general patent issues, typical lawsuits that might come from a competitor, that kind of thing. Trade secrets are difficult to insure. Sometimes we get them thrown in on a limited basis. It usually won't cover lawsuits that come from if employees leave and they wind up taking information with them, and you hire employees, and you wind up getting sued for that. That's typically not covered. And then there used to be coverage for offense. So another issue that you have, if you have, let's say you're a small company, you've got one patent. If you don't enforce your patent, you will actually legally lose it. So you have to enforce your patents. And maybe you're getting infringed on by Apple, and in this case, you're not really going to be able to afford to bring litigation against Apple and win. They'll just crush you. And so there used to be insurance where you could have offensive coverage available for you to sue them. But that's not really readily available at this time. So what's uninsurable? What we were talking about up here is primarily uninsurable. So the punchline is there is no insurance for this really. And what I mean by that is if I have intellectual property and I think that it's worth, if Robert says that it's worth $10 million and a hacker gets in and they take it, there is no insurance company that's going to write me a $10 million check. It doesn't exist at this time. I'm not sure that it will. It's a difficult area. You have to come up with some sort of pre-agreed valuation. You have to come up with what a loss is, which is tricky, and then how much that loss would be. So it's a complicated area that I think if you look at companies and talk about the value of their overall IP, it's maybe the thing that's most valuable to them, but there's not really a way to protect it like you would if you own a building or real estate, that kind of thing. So those are the areas that are really uninsurable at this time, and that might change, but that's kind of the quick snapshot and overview of the intellectual property insurance marketplace.
So the bottom line is companies need to be very proactive in protecting their IP.
You do. Insurance isn't going to pay for the loss.
Excellent. Are there any questions? It's early, we know. Another cup of coffee?
There's a question.
Excellent.
Morning, John Graham from Zurich. This question is for Marshall. Could you talk a little bit about virtual currencies and your view about where that's going and the effectiveness around protecting that kind of data?
Sure. So I probably don't have as good of an answer as you're looking for. When it comes to virtual currencies, my job is focused more around how it's used maliciously. And if you think of like Liberty Reserve, which is one of the largest markets for trading in virtual currency for attackers, that was recently shut down last year by the FBI. And what we've seen is a scattering of lots of other little markets trying to take its place, but not one that's emerged as the victor, if you will. So right now, cyber criminals are using kind of a hodgepodge of a site over here, a site over here, maybe one site over here, in order to actually trade in virtual currency. Other than that, I can't really speak to if you want to know, is Bitcoin evil? I don't honestly know. I think we'll see how that plays out. Is Dogecoin evil? We'll find out about that too. So I know it's probably not as good of an answer as you're looking for, but the reality is I can't speak to it in my experience.